The wine hit Nyla before the laughter did, cold and sharp, soaking in her thin braids and dripping on her forehead, her eyes, her cheeks, leaving red streaks down the front of her faded uniform like a stain that would never wash out. For half a second, the room went completely quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind where everyone is deciding whether to laugh or pretend they didn't see anything. And then the laughter came, bursting out loud and careless, bouncing off the glass walls of the dining hall like it had nowhere else to go. The sound was worse than the wine, cutting deeper than any liquid ever could, and Nyla stood there frozen, holding a silver tray that suddenly felt too heavy for her small arms, her fingers trembling but refusing to drop it, because dropping it would mean she lost control completely. Across from her stood Preston Vale, the billionaire's son, his lips curled in a smile that didn't reach his eyes, taller than her, dressed in crisp white, his hands clean, his future already planned and paid for, the crystal wine glass dangling loosely from his fingers, empty now. "I said watch where you're going," he said, his voice calm, almost bored, like spilling wine on a 12-year-old was just another Tuesday afternoon. Nyla opened her mouth, but no sound came out, her heart hammering so loud she wondered if anyone could hear it over the laughter that kept coming in waves. At the head of the table, Preston's parents laughed too, not awkward laughter, not nervous laughter, but real laughter, the kind that says this is funny, this is entertainment, and phones came out, someone zoomed in, someone else probably hit record. Nyla's face burned hotter than the wine was cold, standing in a room full of people who had more money than her entire neighborhood combined, and not one of them stood up for her, not one of them said her name, because to them she didn't have one. She was just the maid, just part of the furniture, just another face they'd forget by dessert. The wine dripped from her chin onto the marble floor, red on white, a mess someone else would clean, probably her. "Clean yourself up," Preston said lightly, waving his hand like he was dismissing a servant, which technically he was. "And next time, don't hover." Nyla swallowed hard, forcing down the tears that wanted to come, because she had learned early that crying only made things worse, that her grandmother had taught her silence could be armor if you wore it right. So she said nothing, lowered her eyes, took one small step back, her hand tightening around the tray until her knuckles turned white. What no one noticed was that tightening hand. What no one cared to ask was why a 12-year-old was working in a room like this in the first place, and what no one in that room could imagine, could not even begin to imagine, was that this moment, this laugh, this spill was about to cost them $400 million. They thought this was the end of her story, thought she'd go home, wash out the wine, come back tomorrow with her head down and her mouth shut. They were wrong. And if you've ever watched someone in power laugh while someone smaller stood humiliated, powerless, invisible, then stay with us, because what happened next didn't happen fast, didn't happen loud, it happened quietly, and that made it dangerous, because the quiet ones are always the ones you should have been watching. Before we dive into this story, tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. Someone near you might be watching too. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so this won't be the last time you'll hear stories like this. The door slammed behind Nyla, so hard the sound echoed down the long hallway like a gunshot. And she didn't run, but she walked fast, faster than she ever had, her shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor as wine continued to drip from her hair onto her shoulders, leaving a trail of red dots behind her like breadcrumbs she couldn't take back. Her chest burned, not from crying, but from holding it in, from forcing herself not to break in a place where breaking would become entertainment, where her tears would be screenshots, where her pain would be a story they'd tell at dinner parties for years. Behind her, the laughter returned, following her like a shadow she couldn't shake, and someone joked about kids these days. Someone else said she should be grateful to even be there at all. Another voice laughed and said, "Relax, it's just wine," as if humiliation could be measured in liquid ounces, as if dignity had a price tag they could calculate and dismiss. "Just wine," they said, but Nyla knew better, knew that some stains never wash out no matter how hard you scrub, that some moments change you in ways soap and water can't fix. She pushed into the service bathroom and locked the door, her hands shaking as she gripped the sink, and the mirror above showed a girl she barely recognized, her braids dark and heavy with wine, her uniform clinging to her small frame, her eyes looking older than 12, too old, the kind of old that comes from seeing too much too soon. She turned on the faucet and plunged her hands under cold water, watching the red swirl down the drain in spirals that reminded her of blood, and she scrubbed her face slowly, carefully, the way her grandmother taught her when life felt too loud and the world felt too cruel. Never rush your dignity, her grandmother used to say, sitting on the porch with her hands folded in her lap like she was holding something precious. That's how people steal it. When you're in a hurry, when you're panicked, when you forget who you are. Nyla straightened, took a breath, then another, deeper this time, and wiped her face with rough paper towels that scratched her skin but felt honest somehow, real in a way nothing else in that mansion did. She adjusted her collar, smoothed down her uniform as best she could, and practiced the calm look she had learned to wear like a shield, the look that confused adults because they expected anger or tears, not this quiet composure that made them wonder what she was thinking. She unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway, and no one looked at her, not the staff rushing past with trays, not the security guard checking his phone, not the guests who'd watched her humiliation like it was theater, and that was the part that hurt the most, not the laughter, but the forgetting, the way she could be so visible one moment and completely invisible the next. At the end of the hall, through the open doors of the dining room, she could see the family again, Preston leaning back in his chair like a king on a throne, his parents deep in conversation about contracts and timelines, and numbers so large Nyla couldn't picture them. Numbers that seemed more important than people, more valuable than dignity. $400 million, she had heard them say earlier while refilling glasses, the words floating past her like she wasn't even there, and she didn't understand all of it, didn't know about corporate deals or investment portfolios, but she understood this much. It was important, grown-up important, the kind of important that made people fly across the country and dress in their best clothes and shake hands like they were sealing fate. And yet, a child being humiliated meant nothing, registered as less than a footnote, barely worth remembering. Nyla picked up another tray and went back to work because that was what they expected: silence, obedience, forgetfulness, the same cycle that had kept people like her invisible for generations. But here's what they didn't know, what they couldn't see because they'd never bothered to look closely. Silence, when chosen, is not the same as silence forced, and a quiet person is not the same as a powerless one. As Nyla moved through the room, refilling water glasses and clearing plates, she listened, really listened, because she had learned early that adults talked freely around people they believed were invisible, said things they would never say out loud otherwise, dropped names and dates and promises and shortcuts like loose change they didn't think anyone would pick up, and tucked away in Nyla's memory, without anyone noticing, without anyone caring. Pieces began to settle into place like puzzle fragments finding their edges. And if you've ever stayed quiet because speaking felt dangerous, because your voice felt too small in a room full of people who thought they owned the world, you already know this truth. Silence can be a cage, or it can be a weapon, and the difference is in who's holding the key. They thought they had humiliated her, thought they'd put her in her place, thought this 12-year-old girl would go home and forget and come back tomorrow ready to serve them again. What they were really doing, what they couldn't see because arrogance is the best blindfold, was giving her time, giving her space to watch and learn and understand exactly who they were when they thought no one was paying attention. The difference is the key, and you don't want to lose this key. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the exact moment Nyla unlocks her power, and the Vallas realize they built their fortune on quicksand. The bucket tipped over before Nyla could stop it, water splashing across the cracked kitchen floor in a wave that spread toward the door like it was trying to escape, and she stood frozen, hands shaking, watching the dirty water carry bits of soap and shame across the tiles her grandmother had scrubbed 1,000 times before. Her grandmother turned sharply from the stove, wooden spoon still in hand, concern flashing across her face before she even said a word, because mothers and grandmothers always know, can always tell when something's broken inside the children they love. "Nyla," she asked, her voice soft but urgent, crossing the small kitchen in 2 steps. "Baby, what happened?" That question, those 4 simple words spoken with so much love, broke the dam Nyla had been building since the moment that wine hit her face, and her shoulders collapsed inward, her whole body folding like paper as she slid down against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest, her uniform still faintly stained no matter how hard she had scrubbed it in that mansion bathroom. The smell of wine clinging to her like a memory that refused to leave. She tried to speak, but nothing came out except a sound that wasn't quite crying, wasn't quite screaming, just raw and honest and 12 years old. Her grandmother knelt in front of her, strong hands steady on Nyla's shoulders, eyes gentle but sharp, the kind of sharp that comes from surviving things you shouldn't have to survive. "Slow down," she said quietly, firmly, like she was anchoring Nyla to something solid. "Breathe first, then tell me." So Nyla did, the words tumbling out in broken pieces, telling her everything about the glass and the laughter and the phones and the way Preston's parents laughed like it was part of the show, like humiliating a child was entertainment they'd paid good money to see. She told her how small she felt standing there, how everyone kept eating like nothing had happened, kept talking about their deals and their money while wine dripped off her chin onto their expensive floor. She told her how she kept working because she didn't know what else to do, didn't know if walking out would mean her grandmother lost the cleaning contract, lost the income they needed to keep the lights on and food in the fridge. Her grandmother didn't interrupt once, didn't try to comfort or fix or explain away, just listen with the kind of attention that makes you feel heard in a world that mostly makes you feel invisible. When Nyla finished, the room went quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator that hadn't worked right in years, and her grandmother stood slowly, turned off the stove where rice had been cooking, and sat down across from Nyla. Her face changed now, the softness replaced by something older and harder, something that looked like steel wrapped in brown skin and determination. "They crossed the line," she said, and her voice had an edge Nyla had never heard before, sharp enough to cut glass. "I didn't do anything wrong," Nyla whispered, needing to hear it said out loud, needing confirmation that she wasn't crazy for feeling destroyed. "I know," her grandmother replied immediately. No hesitation, no doubt. "That's exactly why it matters." She reached into a drawer, the one that stuck and squeaked, and pulled out a warm manila envelope that looked like it had been opened and closed 100 times, and inside were papers Nyla had seen before but never asked about, because children learn early which questions adults don't want to answer. Contracts, letters, names printed in bold black ink that looked official and permanent. "Your mama worked in places like that too," her grandmother said softly, carefully, like she was handling something fragile. "Not as a maid, though, as a numbers woman, an accountant, smart and careful, the kind of smart that sees things people don't want her to see." Nyla looked up, her breath catching. "Is that why she left?" Her grandmother hesitated, just for a moment, just long enough for Nyla to know the answer was going to hurt. "She didn't leave. Baby," she said, sliding one paper forward and tapping a name at the bottom with her finger, a familiar name, a name Nyla had heard at the dinner table that night, the same family name stitched on the napkins and printed on the wine bottles. She was pushed, erased like she never existed, like her work and her intelligence and her life didn't matter because she saw something they wanted to stay hidden. Nyla stared at the paper, her mind racing, connecting dots she didn't know existed until this moment, and the laughter from earlier echoed in her ears again, but now it sounded different, smaller, more desperate, like people laughing to cover up something rotten underneath. "They don't remember faces," her grandmother said, her voice steady and cold. "But they remember threats, and your mama was a threat because she knew the truth." Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, cutting through the night like a warning, and Nyla felt something shift inside her, something that turned grief into focus, humiliation into purpose. And if you've ever realized that the people who hurt you once hurt someone you loved before, you know exactly what changed in Nyla at that moment. Know that this was no longer just about spilled wine or public shame. This was about a debt that had never been paid, a story that had never been finished, and a 12-year-old girl who suddenly understood that sometimes justice doesn't come from adults or systems or fairness. Sometimes it comes from the ones they underestimated, the ones they thought were too young or too powerless to matter. If you want to see this debt paid in full and you're ready to watch karma deliver a $400 million punch, give this video a like and tell us in the comments. What's the one thing Preston deserves to lose the most? The folder hit the table harder than it needed to, papers sliding forward with edges curling. Old ink meeting the dim kitchen light like evidence in a courtroom. And Nyla flinched at the sound. Not from fear, but from the weight of what it represented, the heaviness of secrets that had been buried for years suddenly exposed in her grandmother's small kitchen. Her grandmother didn't rush. Never did when something mattered this much. Pulling out a chair that scraped against the floor with a sound that made Nyla's teeth hurt, sitting down slowly like a woman about to tell the truth whether the room was ready for it or not. "Read the name," she said, her finger pointing to a signature at the bottom of a contract that looked official and expensive, the kind of document that gets notarized and filed away in offices with marble floors. Nyla leaned in, her eyes tracing the letters once, then again slower, and the name felt heavier the second time she read it, familiar in a way that made her stomach turn, the same last name printed on those wine bottles, the same name stitched into the fancy napkins at the mansion, the same name Preston carried around like a crown he didn't have to earn because it was handed to him at birth. Her stomach tightened into a knot that wouldn't come undone. "That's them," Nyla whispered, her voice barely there. Her grandmother nodded once, sharp and certain. "Yes, that's them." Nyla looked up, confused and suddenly afraid in a way she hadn't been before, because this wasn't just about wine and laughter anymore. This was about something bigger, something that connected her pain to her mother's past in ways she didn't understand yet. "Why do we have this?" Her grandmother exhaled through her nose, the way people do when they're deciding how much truth to give at once, how much a 12-year-old can handle before it becomes too much to carry. "Because your mama was careful," she said, her voice steady but sad. "And because some people make mistakes when they think no one is watching, when they believe the help is too stupid or too scared to understand what's happening right in front of them." She slid another page forward, this one covered in numbers and dates and signatures, lines that didn't add up the way they should even in Nyla's young eyes, gaps that looked intentional, like someone had moved money around hoping nobody would notice or care. They were building something big back then. Her grandmother continued, her hands folded on the table like she was praying or preparing for battle, maybe both. "Bigger than tonight's dinner, bigger than anyone knew. And your mama saw what they were hiding, saw the numbers that didn't match, the accounts that appeared and disappeared like magic tricks." Nyla's chest felt tight, her breathing shallow. Did she tell them she knew? She tried to, her grandmother said softly, and the softness made it worse somehow, made it more real. That was her mistake, thinking honesty mattered to people like that, thinking they'd thank her for catching their errors instead of seeing her as a problem that needed to be eliminated. The room went quiet, not the comfortable kind of quiet, but the kind that makes you sit straighter, makes memories surface whether you invite them or not, makes the air feel thick with everything that's been left unsaid for too long. It didn't fire her, her grandmother said, each word deliberate and sharp. They erased her, locked doors in her face, put her name on blacklists, told lies to people who didn't bother asking questions, made sure she couldn't work anywhere that mattered, turned her into a ghost while she was still breathing. Nyla swallowed hard, her throat dry. Is that why she? Her grandmother nodded before Nyla could finish, before the question could fully form, because some answers don't need to be spoken out loud to be understood. That's why she came home tired every night. That's why she stopped smiling the way she used to. That's why she told you to listen more than you speak, to watch everything, to remember that power. Doesn't shout, it waits. Nyla leaned back, the chair creaking under her slight weight, her mind racing back to that dinner table, to the laughter, to the confidence, to the way Preston's parents spoke like nothing could touch them, like they were untouchable not because they were good, but because they were rich, and rich people don't face consequences the way everyone else does. They didn't know, couldn't know, that this 12-year-old girl cleaning their plates and refilling their glasses was connected to a woman they destroyed years ago, a woman whose files and records and careful documentation sat in a kitchen drawer waiting for the right moment. Her grandmother reached across the table and placed her warm, strong hand over Nyla's cold, trembling one. "You don't owe them anything," she said, her eyes fierce and loving at the same time. Not silence, not fear, Not forgiveness, nothing. Nyla nodded slowly, something shifting inside her, grief turning into something sharper, something that felt like clarity, like purpose. And if you've lived long enough, you know this feeling. The moment you realize a story you thought was finished never actually ended. It just changed hands, passed from one generation to the next like an inheritance nobody asked for, but everybody has to deal with. And tonight, without meaning to, without understanding what they were really doing, they had handed that story to a 12-year-old girl they thought was invisible, powerless, forgettable. And that was going to be the biggest mistake they ever made. Nyla's hand hovered over the phone like it was a live wire, trembling in the darkness of the mansion's hallway, where she'd found it sitting on a marble console table, abandoned and glowing. Preston's parents' personal phone left unattended for just 60 seconds while they stepped into the library to argue about something she couldn't quite hear. One message lit up the screen, bright and demanding, impossible to ignore. Confirm the deal before noon tomorrow. No exceptions, don't make us wait. Her stomach twisted into knots that felt like they'd never come undone, because this was it, the deal everyone had been whispering about all night, the $400 million contract that could make or break careers, the kind of money that moved governments and newspapers and entire industries, the kind of deal that men in suits flew across oceans to finalize with handshakes and champagne. And here it was, glowing in her small brown hands, a portal into power she wasn't supposed to touch, wasn't supposed to see, wasn't supposed to understand, except she did understand, more than they knew, more than they'd ever imagined a 12-year-old Maid could comprehend. A sudden thought slammed into her, like a freight train at full speed, and she remembered the humiliation, the wine dripping down her hair onto her uniform, the laughter that cut deeper than any knife, Preston leaning back in his chair with that smirk, his parents' smiles cruel and entertained, and she wondered how many people had their dignity stripped in that dining room over the years. How many had swallowed shame and kept walking because fighting back seemed impossible when you're powerless. And they're everything. Her fingers traced the edge of the phone screen, and she remembered something her grandmother had said earlier about her mother being erased, about how the powerful only remember threats, and suddenly Nyla understood what a threat actually looked like, not violence or shouting, but information, timing, the ability to be in the right place at the right moment with the right knowledge. The number at the top of the message thread belonged to someone important. She could tell by the way it was saved with a title instead of name. Board chair, and Nyla's heart raced because she remembered her grandmother's old friend, a lawyer who had once advised her mother, a woman who'd stood up to billionaires quietly and won because she understood leverage, understood that power isn't always about who has the most money, but who has the most information at the crucial moment. A knock on the door behind her made Nyla jump, nearly dropping the phone. "Are you okay, Nyla?" Her grandmother's voice called from somewhere. But wait, her grandmother wasn't here at the mansion. That didn't make sense, and Nyla realized she was remembering wrong, mixing up moments, the fear making her thoughts scattered and wild. She glanced at the phone again, her mind working faster than it ever had, faster than during any test at school, faster than when she had to make change for customers at her grandmother's weekend market stall, and she understood with crystal clarity that this was her moment. Not revenge exactly, not yet, but control, power, the chance to prove that humiliation could be turned into something they would regret for the rest of their lives. Her thumbs moved across the screen with the calm precision of someone who'd rehearsed this in her mind 1,000 times, even though she'd never imagined actually doing it, typing words that felt both terrifying and right. Consider the deal canceled, effective immediately, compliance issues identified. She hit send before she could think better of it, before fear could stop her, before the rational part of her brain could scream about consequences, and the phone slipped from her fingers for just a second before she caught it, her whole body shaking now, adrenaline flooding her system like electricity. The message showed as delivered, then read, and Nyla knew with absolute certainty that the world would never see her the same way again. Would never see them the same way either, because she just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped, couldn't be undone, couldn't be explained away with more laughter and wine. They thought she was invisible, thought she was powerless, thought a 12-year-old black girl in a stained uniform was nothing more than furniture that breathed and occasionally needed to be scolded. They were about to learn just how catastrophically wrong they were. And if you've ever been 12 years old, small, underestimated, facing adults who thought the world owed them everything, you understand how it feels when suddenly, for one fleeting second that stretches into eternity, the scales tip in your favor and you realize you're not as powerless as they made you believe, that intelligence and timing can beat money and arrogance. That sometimes the smallest person in the room holds the biggest card, and all you have to do is have the courage to play it. Join the millions of people who watch this channel for the full story on how power really works. If you're ready to see the invisible become the unstoppable, subscribe to our community right now, because the game has officially begun. The mansion was quiet that night, but it wasn't peaceful, not even close, because every marble floor, every gilded frame, every crystal chandelier seemed to hum with the echoes of what had just happened, what Nyla had just done, and she moved through the halls with the phone still warm in her pocket, her small frame dwarfed by the enormity of the house, yet she felt taller than she ever had before, like she'd grown 3 inches in the last 3 minutes. Power, she realized with a clarity that felt almost painful, wasn't about size or wealth or having your name on buildings. It was about knowing what others didn't expect you to know, being where others didn't expect you to be, acting when others thought you were too scared or too young or too nothing to matter. In the dining hall, Preston's parents were still seated at that long table that could fit 20 people, but only ever sat the important ones, discussing numbers and contracts in voices that were smooth and casual, as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just humiliated a child an hour ago, as if the universe operated on their schedule and their rules and nobody else's mattered. They didn't know she had read the message, didn't know she had sent a reply that would detonate their carefully constructed world, didn't know that the spill of wine was not the end of anything, but the beginning of everything. Nyla sat on the edge of the grand staircase, hiding in shadows the way she'd learned to do, making herself small and invisible, because invisible people see everything while visible people only see what they want to see, and she watched them, studied them like a scientist studying insects under glass, cold and analytical despite the anger burning her chest. She remembered the faces that had laughed earlier, could still hear those sounds sharp in her ears like broken glass. Remembered the way Preston had smirked as if the world owed him obedience, as if being born into money meant being born into the right to treat people however you wanted without consequences. She clenched her fists but kept her face calm, kept her breathing steady, because her grandmother's words echoed in her mind like a prayer or a battle cry. Power doesn't shout. It waits, it sees, it moves when the world is unprepared, when arrogance has made people blind and stupid. Her heartbeat slowed, matching the rhythm of the house, every tick of the grandfather clock in the corner reminding her that she had time, that she could choose how to spend it, that she didn't need anger or yelling or dramatic confrontations because they had given her something far more valuable than their attention. They had given her their underestimation, their certainty that she didn't matter, and that certainty was going to destroy them. A notification pinged softly from the phone in her pocket, barely audible, but to Nyla it sounded like thunder, like an earthquake, like the beginning of the end, and she knew without looking that the message she had sent had been read, had been processed, had started conversations in rooms she would never see with people whose names she would never know. Already she could feel tension in the air, something shifting, a ripple she couldn't see, but could sense the way animals sense storms before they arrive. And somewhere in offices with leather chairs and floor-to-ceiling windows, board members were raising their voices in disbelief. Emails were being sent and unsent and sent again. Lawyers were being called at home during dinner, and the empire she had only glimpsed as a maid, the empire that seemed so solid and permanent and untouchable, was beginning to tremble. And yet Nyla did not smile, didn't allow herself even that small victory, because she knew from watching her grandmother survive impossible things that real power was patience. Real power waited while the arrogant destroyed themselves with their own confidence. Real power let them think they were still in control right up until the moment they realized control was an illusion they'd been selling themselves. Outside, the night was deep and still, the kind of still that makes you think the world has stopped breathing. And inside, a 12-year-old girl held a storm in her hands without speaking a single word, without making a single threat, without doing anything that would make the adults in the room see her as anything other than what they'd already decided she was: nothing. And if you've ever watched someone underestimated, someone dismissed, someone laughed at, standing quietly in the corner while the mighty begin to falter and stumble and realize too late that they made a terrible mistake, you know exactly why silence can terrify more than any scream, why stillness can be more dangerous than any action, why the person nobody's watching is often the person everyone should have been watching all along. Because tonight, in this mansion with its marble and gold and arrogance, Nyla had learned the greatest truth that most people never learn. People always reveal themselves when they think no one important is watching, and she had been watching, remembering, understanding, and now, finally, she was ready to act. The phone vibrated again, sharper this time, angrier, almost like it was alive and demanding attention, and Nyla froze mid-step on the staircase, her hand gripping the railing so hard her knuckles went white, listening as every footstep, every whisper of silk and marble in the mansion felt louder tonight. Amplified by the tension she had set in motion like dominoes she'd tipped over without fully understanding how far they would fall. She pulled the phone from her pocket with shaking hands and glanced at the screen, and another message had arrived. This one from someone new, someone whose contact name made her stomach drop. CO assistant. Do not ignore, and the message itself was short, urgent, demanding in a way that made her realize just how big this thing was becoming, how fast it was spiraling. We need clarification immediately. The deal is at serious risk. Respond now. Her 12-year-old heart pounded hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, in her ears, in her fingertips. But it wasn't fear this time. Not exactly. It was something else. Something that felt like power mixed with terror, mixed with the intoxicating realization that she had actually done something, had actually moved pieces on a board she wasn't supposed to be playing on. She had seen the laughter earlier, the mocking confidence of Preston and his parents, their absolute certainty that nothing and nobody could touch them. And now she could feel the first tremors of their world cracking, could sense the panic spreading through their network like a virus they couldn't contain. She tucked the phone back in her pocket and moved silently down the hall, her feet barely making a sound on the expensive runner carpet, and the chandelier overhead swayed slightly in a draft from somewhere, catching the dim light and scattering it across the marble floor in patterns that looked like broken glass, like shattered confidence, like everything solid becoming liquid. Every reflection reminded her of eyes that would now watch her differently, that would see her as something other than furniture, whether they realized it yet or not, whether they were ready for it or not. In the dining room, Preston was pacing now, his hands twitching with irritation instead of hanging loose and casual the way they had when he'd poured that wine, and his parents were staring at their phones, their screens, their tablets, the smiles gone completely, replaced by sharp lines of panic that made them look older, smaller, more human than they'd seemed before. They hadn't expected resistance, never did, because people like them lived their whole lives in bubbles where everyone said yes, and nobody pushed back, and consequences were things that happened to other people, to poor people, to people without lawyers and connections and inherited wealth. Nyla leaned against the doorway, unseen but seeing everything, and she absorbed it all like a sponge. The messages, the whispers, the frantic gestures, the way Preston's father kept rubbing his temples like he could massage away reality, the way his mother kept refreshing her email like the right message would appear and fix everything if she just checked one more time. Every word they said aloud, every panic gesture, was evidence, proof that arrogance always leaves cracks no matter how thick the armor seems, and cracks, no matter how small, could become windows for someone patient. Someone quiet, someone underestimated who knew how to watch and wait and strike at exactly the right moment. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind like a recording she'd played so many times she had it memorized. The world will never stop talking, Nyla. People with power never shut up. They think their words matter more than anyone else's, but you just need to know when to listen and when to act, when to absorb and when to move, because the person who talks the most usually understands the least. She exhaled slowly, deliberately, feeling her heartbeat return to normal, and she understood with perfect clarity that the power wasn't in confrontation, wasn't in standing up and announcing what she'd done, wasn't in demanding apologies or explanations. The power was in letting them fight themselves, letting them panic and scramble and make mistakes while she remained untouched, invisible, a ghost in their machine. And if you've ever been small, unseen, overlooked by adults who thought their wealth and status made them untouchable, made them better, made them exempt from the basic rules of decency that govern everyone else, you understand exactly why this moment was everything, why watching the mighty panic is sweeter than any revenge, why seeing the powerful lose their footing is more satisfying than any apology they could ever give. The next message appeared on the screen, and Nyla didn't even need to read the whole thing to know what it said, could tell from the first few words. Call immediately or the board will cancel everything. This is your final notice. Nyla smiled, not out of cruelty, not because she enjoyed their suffering, but because she knew with absolute certainty that the real game had just started, that everything up until now had been set up. And this time, for the first time in her life, she would finish something on her terms. Not theirs, not anyone else's, just hers. The boardroom was colder than Nyla expected, even through the phone line, and she could hear it in their voices, that particular kind of cold that comes from expensive air conditioning and even more expensive panic, voices clipped and sharp and urgent, cutting through the mansion like knives through paper. Every word she could hear through the speaker that Preston's father had foolishly put on speakerphone. Thinking he was alone in the library, cut through the silence with precision, and Nyla stood in the hallway, just outside the cracked door, barely breathing, listening to Preston's parents try to salvage what they believed was untouchable, their voices frantic in a way she'd never heard from people who usually spoke with such confidence and authority. Her hands tightened around the serving tray she was carrying as cover, just in case someone found her there, but her mind was 1,000 miles away, processing every update, every shift in tone, understanding that each word being spoken was another strike against the empire they'd built on arrogance and entitlement, and the certainty that people like her didn't matter. Numbers shifted, deadlines were threatened, emails were being drafted and deleted and drafted again, and the words canceled, breach, and liability repeated so often they became a drumbeat, a rhythm, a funeral march for something that had seemed immortal just hours before. Nyla's heart raced, but her face remained perfectly calm, practiced and smooth, because her grandmother had taught her that the calmest person in the room, or in this case the hallway, often had the sharpest power, the deepest understanding of what was really happening beneath all the noise and panic. Preston and his parents had assumed she was too small, too young, too insignificant to understand corporate deals and board dynamics and the intricate dance of business negotiations, and that mistake, that fundamental underestimation of her intelligence and her capacity to learn by watching and listening, had just cost them time, and time in their world was money. The kind of money that moved empires and toppled dynasties and changed family legacies forever. A sudden shout cut through the chaos, so loud it made Nyla jump even though she'd been expecting something like this. And Preston had slammed his fist on what sounded like glass or marble, his voice breaking with frustration and disbelief. How is this even possible? This is impossible. We had everything locked down, every signature, every guarantee, every backup plan. The assistant's voice came through the speaker, firm and professional and utterly unmoved by his tantrum. It's been handled at the highest level, Mr. Vale. The board supports the cancellation after reviewing the compliance concerns that were flagged, and there's simply no reversing it at this point. The decision is final. Nyla exhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch like taffy, feeling it fill the spaces between words. And she could almost hear the echo of the power shift, could almost see the invisible cracks spreading through the foundation of the family that had laughed at her just hours before, had treated her like she was less than human, less than worthy of basic respect. This was the moment when hubris meets reality, when arrogance crashes into consequence, when people who've never heard the word no suddenly discover that it's the only word that matters. Outside the library door, the night pressed against the windows, dark and patient, and inside the mansion every wall seemed to vibrate with tension, with the understanding that something fundamental had changed, that the balance of power had shifted in ways nobody could have predicted or prevented. Preston's parents were recalculating everything now. scrambling to salvage what they thought was untouchable, pulling strings that used to work but now hung limp and useless in their desperate hands. And the empire that had seemed invincible just this morning now trembled on a foundation that turned out to be far more fragile than anyone had realized. And Nyla, small and 12, and underestimated by everyone who mattered in that room, by everyone who thought they understood how the world worked, realized with perfect clarity that sometimes the youngest, quietest, and seemingly weakest people have the clearest vision of justice, can see through the noise and the money and the power to the simple truth underneath. Actions have consequences, cruelty leaves marks, and the universe keeps better records than anyone thinks. Because the ones who think laughter can humiliate forever, who believe their wealth makes them immune to karma, who assume that powerless means harmless, they never expect patience to strike back, never imagine that silence can be a weapon more devastating than any gun, never understand that a 12-year-old girl with nothing to lose and everything to prove might just be the most dangerous person they've ever underestimated. That moment of consequence, that final realization of their mistake, is what we study here at the channel. If Nyla's story proved to you that patience is the ultimate weapon, and you're ready for the next deep dive into the psychology of power, like this video, subscribe, and let us know what piece of Nyla's strategy surprised you the most. Nyla's fingers hovered above the keyboard of the laptop she'd found open in the study, her small hands steady despite the storm raging in her chest, despite knowing that what she was about to do would cross a line she could never uncross, and the screen glowed with the subject line she had typed herself, each letter carefully chosen, deliberate and precise. Deal cancellation, compliance violation confirmed, effective immediately. She had spent the last hour piecing it together from fragments of conversations she'd overheard, from documents she'd glimpsed when clearing plates, from her mother's old files that her grandmother had shown her, and every word was measured, every phrase calculated, no emotion, no anger, no personal feelings, just cold hard fact presented in the language that these people understood. The language of liability and risk and corporate consequences. Outside the study, the mansion's corridors were filled with tension so thick it felt like you could reach out and touch it, could grab handfuls of it like cotton candy made of fear, and Preston's parents were somewhere down the hall reviewing more documents, their voices tight and strained, each word like a hammer striking against glass that was already cracked and ready to shatter. Their empire, built on decades of arrogance and the assumption that money could fix anything and silence anyone, seemed to quiver under the weight of words written by a 12-year-old who wasn't supposed to understand any of this, wasn't supposed to know what fiduciary duty or material misrepresentation meant, wasn't supposed to be capable of connecting dots that adults with law degrees had missed or ignored. The assistant's voice from earlier still rang in Nyla's mind, professional and clipped and final. It's done. The board acknowledges the cancellation. There's nothing anyone can do to reverse it at this point. The compliance issues are too serious to overlook. The sound of her finger hitting the send button echoed in her ears like a gunshot in an empty church. Final and irreversible, and somehow both terrifying and liberating at the same time. And Nyla's heart pounded not from fear exactly, but from the sharp, intoxicating edge of power she had never imagined she would feel. Power that came not from money or status or being born into the right family, but from being in the right place with the right information at the exact right moment when the universe decided that justice was overdue. In that moment, she realized the truth her grandmother had always hinted at but never said directly. Authority isn't about size or wealth or having your name on buildings. It's about knowing the right move at the right time and having the courage to make it with calm precision that leaves everyone else scrambling to figure out what just happened. Meanwhile, the mansion erupted in a way that was almost beautiful if you ignored the human cost, if you forgot for a moment that real people were about to lose real things. And Preston's face turned red as he grabbed his phone with shaking hands, his voice breaking through the glassy silence of the moment. How is this possible? I was in charge. We controlled everything. His parents exchanged glances that no longer carried any confidence, any certainty, any of that casual arrogance that had defined them for so long, because the emails, The confirmations, the legal clauses citing specific violations, they weren't just words on a screen anymore. They were a storm descending on their carefully curated world. And storms don't care about your net worth or your connections or how many senators you have on speed dial. Nyla leaned back in the chair that was too big for her, her feet barely touching the ground, breathing slowly and deliberately, trying to process what she'd just done, what she just set in motion. And for a moment she allowed herself a small smile. Not a victory, exactly, because this didn't feel like winning. It felt like surviving, like fighting back, like refusing to be erased the way they'd erased her mother. They had laughed at her, had thought a 12-year-old maid could do nothing, could be nothing, could never touch their world of power and privilege and consequence-free cruelty. But here was the truth that every underestimated person eventually learns. The world is full of people who mistake silence for stupidity, who confuse youth with inability, who assume that poverty equals powerlessness. And those assumptions create blind spots big enough to drive entire empires through. If you've ever been dismissed, humiliated, or laughed at by someone who thought their status protected them from karma, from justice, from the simple mathematical certainty that every action creates an equal and opposite reaction, you know exactly what Nyla felt in that moment. That quiet thrill of knowing the tables are turning. Knowing that the people who made you feel small are about to discover just how wrong they were about everything they thought they knew. Tonight, the empire that had poured wine and laughter over a small girl's dignity was learning a lesson in patience and strategy and consequences, and Nyla, unnoticed by everyone except herself and her grandmother, and maybe God if he was paying attention, had just become the author of their undoing. The ringing seemed endless, cutting through the mansion like a siren warning of impending disaster, each tone sharp and insistent, demanding attention that nobody wanted to give but couldn't avoid, and Preston's parents stared at each other in disbelief, their eyes wide with something Nyla had never seen in them before, actual fear, raw and undisguised, the kind that makes your hands shake and your voice crack no matter how much money you have in the bank. On the other end of the line was the CEO's office, and the voice that came through was calm, professional, unmoved by their panic, speaking with the kind of authority that comes from having actual power instead of just inherited wealth. And in the middle of it all, Nyla sat in her grandmother's kitchen miles away now, having been sent home early with some excuse about feeling sick. But she could picture every moment of what was happening, could imagine their faces as the walls closed in. Her small body remained still at the kitchen table, hands folded in her lap like she was praying or meditating, but her mind raced through everything that was unfolding back at that mansion. The words coming from that speakerphone detailing cancellations and compliance checks and board reviews. Everything that Preston's parents had believed was untouchable now, wobbling precariously like a house of cards in a windstorm. They were arguing, she knew they would be, pleading their case with that special kind of desperation that rich people have when they realize money might not fix something, try to manipulate and negotiate and pull strings that suddenly seem to be attached to nothing at all. But it was useless, completely and utterly useless, because each tactic met with the same firm, unyielding response. No, the decision stands. The board has voted unanimously. There are no appeals in cases involving compliance violations of this magnitude. Nyla swallowed hard, trying not to let a smile slip across her face. Not because she was cruel or enjoyed their suffering exactly, but because she was 12 and this was beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. Beyond any revenge fantasy she might have had while scrubbing wine out of her hair in that cold bathroom. Beyond any justice she thought the universe might deliver. They had laughed at her just hours ago, had spilled wine and mocked, and filmed her humiliation like it was entertainment they'd paid admission to see, had assumed that she was powerless, voiceless, nothing more than a prop in their wealthy lives. And now every ounce of that arrogance was being dismantled piece by piece by someone they had thought was invisible. You don't understand the implications of this. Preston shouted through the phone, his voice breaking with anger and panic in equal measure, probably pacing around that library with his fists clenched, probably looking at his parents for help that they couldn't give because they were drowning too. The voice on the other end remained steady as a heartbeat, unimpressed and unmoved. I understand perfectly, Mr. Vale, which is exactly why the cancellation stands. There will be no exceptions, no special considerations. The compliance issues are too severe and too well documented to ignore. Nyla's grandmother placed a steady, warm hand on her shoulder, grounding her, reminding her that this was real and not some fever dream. "Remember, baby," she whispered, her voice carrying decades of wisdom and survival. "Power isn't loud. Power doesn't need to shout or threaten or make a scene. Power waits and watches and strikes when the world believes it's safe, when arrogance has made people blind." Through the walls of their small kitchen, Nyla could almost hear the whispers of fear creeping into Preston's parents' voices miles away. Could imagine their confident, untouchable facade cracking like ice under pressure. Could picture them scrambling to salvage what had already begun to fall apart in ways they couldn't see or control or buy their way out of. And in that moment, sitting in a kitchen that could fit inside their bathroom, Nyla realized something even more powerful than victory, even more satisfying than revenge. She had learned the art of influence, had discovered the weight of quiet authority, had understood in a way that most 12-year-olds never do, and most adults never learn, that strength doesn't always roar, doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and drama. It often sits silently and patiently, letting the arrogant destroy themselves while you remain untouched and unnoticed until the exact moment when being noticed matters most. By the time that phone call ended, Preston's parents were sitting frozen in their mansion, staring at each other across their expensive furniture, understanding for the first time in their privileged lives that the tables had irrevocably turned, that their money and connections and family name couldn't protect them from consequences, couldn't erase what had been set in motion by a girl they dismissed as easily as they dismissed the wine they'd spilled on her. And Nyla, calm and collected and quietly victorious in a way that had nothing to do with gloating and everything to do with justice, had not yet even begun to play her hand fully, because real power, she thought while her grandmother squeezed her shoulder, is never about the fight itself. It's about knowing you've already won before anyone else realizes the game has even started. The driveway was slick with rain, reflecting the opulent lights of the Vale mansion like a fractured mirror, each reflection distorted and wrong, showing a world that was breaking apart even as it tried to maintain its perfect surface. And Nyla's small frame pressed against a wrought iron gate the next morning, watching the black luxury cars pull in and out with the kind of urgency that only wealth and panic could buy, drivers moving with sharp, jerky motions instead of their usual smooth confidence. Preston's parents had called in reinforcements overnight, and now the mansion swarmed with lawyers and accountants and crisis managers, all of them scrambling to save a deal that was no longer theirs to control, briefcases snapping open and shut, voices overlapping in the morning air, everyone talking and nobody listening, because that's what happens when panic sets in and rational thinking goes out the window. Inside, Preston was pacing like a caged animal who just realized the cage had no door, just walls that kept closing in, and each step he took echoed off the marble floors with a hollow sound that seemed to emphasize how empty all this luxury really was when you couldn't control the one thing that mattered. Each movement was a storm of frustration and disbelief, his hands clenching and unclenching, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth, and the empire they had built on arrogance and entitlement and the casual cruelty of people who'd never been told no was unraveling in real time, thread by thread, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The assistant's repeated confirmations kept coming through on speakerphone, calm and professional and absolutely final, and the meticulous emails Nyla had sent from a phone they had believed was untouched, from an account they'd never thought to secure, because who worries about a 12-year-old Maid having access to anything important, had set off a chain reaction that even she hadn't fully anticipated. Nyla's eyes followed the chaos from her position at the gate, and she had never been in a world like this before, had never seen what millions of dollars in motion actually looked like. But she understood it now in a way most adults never would, because she'd seen both sides, had served their food and cleaned their messes and listened to their careless conversations. And now she watched them drowning in consequences of their own making. Power, she understood with absolute clarity, was not about wealth at all, not about having cars that cost more than houses or houses that cost more than neighborhoods. It was about control, timing, and the courage to act when others believed themselves untouchable, when their arrogance had made them sloppy and their privilege had made them blind. A sudden horn blared outside, sharp and angry, and one of the luxury cars had stalled in the driveway, blocking the others, the driver shouting into his phone while Preston's father appeared at the door, red-faced and furious, screaming about incompetence. But no one could fix it because the car's computer system had crashed and needed a full reset, and it was such a perfect metaphor for everything happening that Nyla almost laughed. It was a symbolic echo of everything unfolding inside that house. This expensive machine breaking down at the worst possible moment, and nothing could be contained anymore. Not the car, not the deal, not their reputation, not their carefully constructed image of invincibility. Nyla's grandmother appeared beside her, having walked over from their apartment 2 blocks away, and she stood there calm, as always, watching the chaos with the satisfied expression of someone who'd seen justice delayed but never denied. "They've underestimated you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of generations who'd been underestimated and survived anyway, who'd been invisible and used it as a superpower. "Never forget, baby, patience and precision are stronger than anger and pride. Always have been, always will be." Inside the mansion, Preston's parents were now on the phone with high-profile investors whose names Nyla recognized from news articles, their voices shaking for the first time in lives that had been built on never showing weakness, their confident exteriors cracking like eggshells under pressure, revealing the fragile, frightened people underneath all that money and status. Every word Nyla had sent, every action she had taken with careful deliberation, was now a ripple that had become a wave that had become a tsunami crashing through their empire. And they still didn't know, couldn't know, would never believe, even if someone told them, that a 12-year-old girl they'd humiliated over spilled wine was the architect of their destruction. And in that moment, standing at that gate watching their world collapse, Nyla realized something she had never known before, something that would change how she saw everything forever. People who think laughter can humiliate others without consequence often leave themselves completely exposed to quiet, calculated justice. Their arrogance had been their mistake, their certainty that she didn't matter had been their trap. And she, the small underestimated girl they dismissed as easily as they'd dismissed her dignity, was holding every single key that mattered. The storm outside was relentless, rain pounding the windows like fists demanding entry, thunder rattling the chandeliers until they swayed and chimed with sounds that were almost musical if you ignored the violence behind them. And yet inside the Vale mansion, a different kind of tempest was unfolding, one that no weather forecast could have predicted and no insurance policy could cover. Preston's parents had gathered in the drawing room with what looked like every lawyer in the state, phones clutched in white-knuckled hands, voices rising and falling in waves of panic and disbelief that crashed against the walls like the storm outside, and the $400 million deal, the one they had treated as untouchable as a birthright, as inevitable as sunrise, was unraveling with each passing second like a sweater caught on a nail. And no one in that room, not the lawyers with their expensive degrees, not the crisis managers with their damage control strategies, not Preston's parents with their decades of business experience, could stop it from coming apart. Nyla sat quietly in the kitchen where she'd been called back for some emergency serving duty, her fingers tracing the edge of a glass of water someone had asked for and then forgotten about, and she could hear everything through the open doorway, the frantic shouts of the lawyers, the hurried whispers of board members calling in from wherever important people go when empires collapse, the crackling tension that filled the air like static electricity before lightning strikes. She had set this in motion hours that felt like years ago, yet watching it unfold in real time was more powerful than she could have imagined, more real than any revenge fantasy, more complete than any apology they could have offered, even if they'd been capable of apologizing, which they clearly weren't. Preston slammed his fist against the glass coffee table, so hard Nyla heard it from 2 rooms away, and his voice cracked with raw emotion she'd never heard from someone who usually spoke with such casual confidence. "This can't be happening. We are Vale Industries. We are untouchable. We've survived recessions and investigations and competitor attacks. How can we be brought down by a compliance issue?" His voice broke on that last word, exposing the vulnerability that wealth and status usually masked so effectively, showing everyone in the room what Nyla had known from the moment she'd met them. That money doesn't make you strong, it just makes you loud. The assistant's voice came again over the speakerphone, calm and measured and absolutely unyielding, like a judge reading a sentence that couldn't be appealed. "The decision is final, Mr. Vale. The board supports the cancellation unanimously. There is no appeal process for violations of this nature and severity." Nyla's grandmother appeared in the doorway behind her, having been allowed in by security who knew her from her cleaning work, and she placed a steady hand on Nyla's shoulder, anchoring her to something solid in a night that felt increasingly surreal. "Remember," she said softly, so quietly that only Nyla could hear over the chaos in the next room. "The world always reveals itself to those who are patient enough to watch. They will make mistakes if you wait long enough. They will expose themselves if you give them enough rope, because arrogance always leads to carelessness, and carelessness always leads to consequences." Every passing second inside that mansion was a masterclass in hubris, a real-time demonstration of what happens when people believe that power alone can protect them from the basic laws of cause and effect that govern everyone else's lives. Preston's parents had believed that money could fix anything, that lawyers could argue away reality, that their family name carried enough weight to bend the rules of business and ethics and basic human decency. And they had laughed at a 12-year-old girl, had spilled wine on her like she was nothing, had filmed her humiliation like it was entertainment, had assumed that invisibility equaled weakness and youth equaled powerlessness. Now every thread of that arrogance was unraveling, every assumption proving catastrophically wrong, and the walls that had seemed impenetrable, that had protected them from consequences their entire lives, trembled with their own fragility, revealed as paper-thin as their empathy, as hollow as their confidence. Nyla leaned back against the counter, her eyes narrowing as lightning illuminated the kitchen in stark white flashes that made everything look like a photograph, frozen and permanent, and she understood now that true power did not roar or demand attention or announce itself with expensive cars and designer clothes. It waited quietly in corners, it observed patiently from shadows, and when the moment was exactly right, when the universe had aligned and justice was finally possible, it struck, with precision that left everyone wondering what the hell just happened. And if you've ever watched someone who thought they were invincible, someone who believed their money made them better than everyone else, someone who laughed at others' pain because they'd never experienced real consequences, if you've ever watched them falter under the weight of their own mistakes and realized too late that they were never as untouchable as they thought, you know the satisfaction is not in their defeat exactly. It's in the undeniable truth that becomes clear to everyone. Watching, actions have consequences, cruelty leaves marks that don't wash away, and no one, not even a mighty, not even the wealthy, not even those born into privilege and power, is beyond the reach of justice when it finally decides to collect what's owed. The chandelier above the grand staircase swayed violently as a gust of wind slammed against the mansion's windows with enough force to make the glass groan. And inside, chaos rippled through every corner like water, finding cracks in a dam that was about to burst completely. Preston's parents were gathered around their laptops at the dining table, where just yesterday they'd laughed at Nyla's humiliation, their voices tight and desperate, hands shaking as they tried to type emails that kept getting longer and more frantic and less coherent, each one trying desperately to salvage a deal that had already slipped through their fingers like sand, like water, like everything they'd taken for granted their entire privileged lives. Every email notification, every phone call that came through with news they didn't want to hear was a reminder that the carefully built empire of wealth and arrogance and casual cruelty could crumble in moments, could fall faster than it took to build, could disappear as quickly as respect disappears when you treat people like they're disposable. Nyla perched quietly on the staircase where she'd been dusting the railings, her small frame almost invisible against the shadowed wood paneling, and her fingers drummed lightly on the banister in a rhythm that matched the storm outside, watching as panic spread like wildfire through rooms that usually only knew confidence and certainty and the absolute conviction that money could fix anything. She had watched for hours now, unseen but fully aware, as the reality of what she'd done settled over them like a fog they couldn't escape, and she knew something they didn't, something that gave her a strange kind of peace. This wasn't luck, this wasn't accident, this wasn't some cosmic coincidence. This was strategy, precision, patience paying off in ways she'd planned without fully understanding how powerful the payoff would be. Preston's frustration finally boiled over in an explosion that had been building all day, and he kicked a chair across the room, so hard it crashed into a marble column, leaving a jagged crack that looked like lightning frozen in stone, an unintentional symbol of the first visible fracture in the Vale dynasty that had seemed eternal. His mother's hands flew to her face, her perfectly manicured fingers covering her mouth as if she could hold back the scream that wanted to escape. How could a 12-year-old do this to us? How is this even possible? The question hung in the air like smoke, unanswered because nobody wanted to say the obvious truth, that they'd underestimated her so completely, so thoroughly, so arrogantly that they'd handed her every tool she needed to dismantle them. Nyla's grandmother appeared at her side on the staircase, moving silently the way she taught Nyla to move, and she was calm and collected as always, her presence steady like a lighthouse in a storm. "They have underestimated you," she whispered, but there was pride in her voice, not just satisfaction, but genuine pride in what her granddaughter had accomplished. "Never forget this lesson, baby. People reveal their weaknesses when they think they are untouchable, when arrogance blinds them to threats they can't imagine, and you just have to wait and watch and remember everything, because their carelessness will always give you what you need." The rain outside intensified, hammering the mansion with relentless force that sounded almost angry, almost intentional, and inside the tension rose higher than the storm ever could. Preston's parents began to argue with each other now, turning on each other the way people do when there's nobody else left to blame, voices sharp with accusations about who should have checked what, who should have seen this coming, who was responsible for the security breach that let a child access information she should never have touched. Every accusation, every raised voice, every finger pointed at someone else was a testament to the unraveling of their control, proof that when empires fall, they rarely fall quietly, they tear themselves apart from inside, while everyone watches. And Nyla sat silently through all of it, her chest rising and falling steadily, her mind sharp and focused even as her body remained perfectly still, and she had learned the most important lesson of her young life. True power was not in shouting or lashing out or making threats or demanding attention. True power was in quiet observation, in letting others destroy themselves with their own arrogance while you remained untouched and unchanged, while you stayed in the shadows until the exact moment when stepping into the light would mean something. By the time the storm outside began to subside, leaving only the soft patter of residual rain against glass, Preston's parents were left with nothing but the echo of their own hubris, sitting in their expensive chairs surrounded by their expensive things, realizing that none of it mattered. None of it could save them. None of it could undo what had been done. And Nyla, underestimated and invisible for so long, overlooked and dismissed and treated like furniture that occasionally needed to be scolded, had become the force they could never contain, the storm they never saw coming, the reckoning they never believed was possible. Because sometimes the quietest observer holds the storm in their hands and knows exactly when to unleash it. And tonight was that moment. The moment when everything they'd built on cruelty and arrogance came crashing down. Around them, while a 12-year-old girl watched with the calm certainty of someone who knew that justice, however delayed, eventually finds its way home. The front door of the Vale mansion slammed open with a force that rattled the ornate frames on the walls, shook the crystal in the cabinets, and sent a shock wave through the house that made everyone freeze mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-panic, and Preston's parents jumped from their seats like they'd been electrocuted, their voices catching mid-argument as a hush fell over the room, so complete you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. The butler, usually a silent shadow who anticipated needs before they were spoken, stepped aside with an expression Nyla had never seen on his professional face, something between shock and satisfaction, to reveal a figure no one had expected, someone whose presence was calm and authoritative and immediately commanding in a way that had nothing to do with volume or theatrics. A stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed the mansion for hours. Nyla, hidden in the upstairs corridor where she'd been watching through the railings, pressed her hands against the polished wood, her eyes wide, because she had not planned for this, had not anticipated this particular chess piece moving onto the board. Yet as she observed the sudden shift in tension, she realized with razor-sharp clarity that this moment could either accelerate their downfall or complicate everything she'd worked for. The visitor was an old family associate, someone Preston's parents clearly recognized from the way their faces went pale, someone who knew every weakness, every flaw, every secret that had been buried beneath layers of wealth and carefully maintained public image. And they were here now, at the perfect storm of chaos, stepping into a house that was already on fire and carrying what looked like gasoline. Preston's father's voice trembled in a way Nyla had never heard, stripped of all the confidence and authority he usually wore like armor. "We weren't expecting you. This isn't a good time. We're in the middle of..." But the visitor raised one hand, just one simple gesture, and stopped a mid-sentence, silencing him as effectively as if they'd physically covered his mouth. The silence that followed was the kind that makes the air itself feel thick and heavy, makes your ears ring, makes you suddenly aware of your own heartbeat and breathing, and every eye in the room, including Preston's, was drawn to the newcomer who had no need to raise their voice to command absolute attention, because real authority doesn't announce itself. It just exists. Nyla's mind raced faster than it had all day, connecting dots, reading body language, understanding with the instinct that comes from spending your life watching powerful people when they think nobody's paying attention. And she realized instantly that the visitor's arrival was not a complication at all. It was an opportunity, a chance to expose everything fully, to let their arrogance crumble under the weight of truth witnessed by someone who actually mattered in their world. The visitor's calm, deliberate steps toward the table where all the laptops and documents were spread out mirrored Nyla's own inner strategy, each movement purposeful and measured, and they spoke slowly with words that cut through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "I've reviewed the situation thoroughly, examined the compliance reports, looked at the timeline of events, and I've seen exactly where the mistakes were made, where corners were cut, where ethics were sacrificed for convenience." Preston's parents froze completely, their faces draining of color like someone had opened a tap and let all the blood run out, their hands shaking visibly now as the reality set in that this wasn't just about a canceled deal anymore. This was about reputation, about legacy, about everything they'd built over decades, potentially crumbling because they'd been cruel to someone they considered beneath notice. "There's no reversing what's been done," the visitor continued, their voice carrying the weight of finality, of decisions that couldn't be appealed or negotiated or bought off. "The decision stands, and frankly, after reviewing how this situation was handled, how a young employee was treated, I'm not sure your company deserves another chance." And Nyla, watching from the shadows above, felt something surge through her that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite triumph. It was more like vindication, like the universe confirming what she'd always suspected. That actions have consequences, that cruelty leaves marks, that you can't buy your way out of basic human decency. She had learned a vital lesson that most people never learn. Sometimes the arrival of the right witness, the right ally, the right person at the right moment can accelerate justice faster than even the most meticulous plan, because in the game of power, timing is everything. And tonight she held all the cards, controlled all the timing, orchestrated every move while they scrambled and panicked and finally understood that the 12-year-old girl they'd humiliated was never powerless at all. She was just patient, and patience, as it turns out, is the most devastating weapon of all. The conference room smelled of expensive leather and stale tension mixed with the kind of desperation that no amount of air freshener could mask. And Preston's parents sat stiffly around the polished mahogany table that had witnessed countless victories and maybe a few defeats, but nothing like this, their faces pale as ghosts, eyes darting nervously toward the head of the room, where the board of directors had convened earlier than scheduled, because crisis doesn't wait for convenient meeting times. The air was thick with urgency that felt almost solid, like you could reach out and grab handfuls of it. And every email, every phone call, every hurried explanation they had attempted in the last 24 hours now felt like whispers against a hurricane, meaningless sounds that accomplished nothing except revealing how truly powerless they'd become. Nyla, small and unnoticed in her grandmother's study back home, could hear everything through her grandmother's phone that had been secretly connected to the meeting by someone who owed them a favor, someone who understood that sometimes justice needs witnesses, and her heart pounded with anticipation so intense it made her hands tremble. The storm of emails and cancellations and frantic phone calls had reached its climax, and what was usually a world ruled by arrogance and entitlement and unchecked power was now teetering on the edge of collapse, and every second felt like watching history being made in real time, like witnessing the exact moment when empires fall and new rules get written. Inside that boardroom, Preston tried to argue, his voice cracking with the desperation of someone who'd never been denied anything significant in his entire life. This is absurd. This is insane. A 12-year-old girl. How could any of this even be possible? How could she have access? How could she understand complex corporate structures? His voice broke on that last word, shattering the illusion of control he had always wielded so effortlessly, exposing the frightened child underneath all that privilege and entitlement. The board chair, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that had seen every trick and excuse in the corporate playbook, leaned forward with the calm authority of someone who knew exactly how much power they held. We've reviewed the contracts thoroughly, examined the compliance reports in detail, analyzed the communications that were flagged, and consulted with our legal team, who confirmed that the violations are legitimate and severe. She paused, letting that sink in, letting them feel the full weight of those words before continuing. The decision is final, Mr. Vale. The cancellation stands. Vale Industries' reputation is at serious risk, and we cannot compromise the integrity of this board by overlooking documented ethical violations, regardless of who committed them or how inconvenient the timing might be. Preston's mother's hands trembled as she clutched a folder that had become her lifeline, papers slipping from her grasp and scattering across the table like autumn leaves, and she looked to her husband with desperation etched so deeply into her face it seemed permanent, transformational. "We can't let this happen," she whispered, but her voice had no strength behind it, no conviction. Just the hollow sound of someone realizing that all their money and connections and carefully cultivated relationships couldn't save them from the consequences of their own cruelty. "We control everything. We've always controlled everything. How can we be losing control now?" And yet, as they spoke, as they pleaded and argued and tried every manipulation tactic they perfected over decades of getting their way, the weight of inevitability settled over them like a burial shroud, heavy and inescapable. Each word, each attempt at negotiation, only reinforced their failure, only highlighted how completely they had underestimated the 12-year-old Maid who had observed quietly, acted with precision, and refused to be invisible just because they found it convenient. They had weaponized their laughter, their casual cruelty, their certainty that people like Nyla didn't matter. And now that weapon had been turned against them by someone who understood that knowledge and timing beat wealth and status every single time. Upstairs in her grandmother's study miles away, Nyla exhaled slowly, her eyes meeting her grandmother's across the small room. And no one in that boardroom had seen her act. No one had suspected her influence. No one had imagined that a child could understand corporate structures and compliance violations and the intricate dance of business relationships well enough to dismantle them. But the results spoke louder than any explanation could. The empire that had mocked her, humiliated her, filmed her degradation like it was entertainment they'd paid to see, was faltering under the weight of its own arrogance. And if you've ever watched the powerful realize they're not as untouchable as they believed, you know that the satisfaction isn't in their suffering. It's in the undeniable proof that actions have consequences, that cruelty eventually meets justice. that the universe keeps better records than anyone thinks, and that sometimes, just sometimes, David really does beat Goliath when David is patient enough, smart enough, and brave enough to strike at exactly the right moment with exactly the right weapon. Cameras flashed relentlessly like lightning trapped in a room. Microphones crowded the podium so thick you could barely see the wood beneath them, and the press room buzzed with anticipation, so electric you could almost taste it, sharp and metallic on your tongue like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Preston's parents had called an emergency press conference in a desperate attempt to control the narrative, to salvage the remnants of their crumbling reputation, to spin this disaster into something manageable before the media circus turned them into permanent laughingstocks. But what they didn't know, what no one in that room realized except for one person watching from a live stream on a borrowed tablet, was that the narrative had already been rewritten by hands they'd never suspected were capable of holding a pen. Nyla, hidden in the back corner of the public library where she'd gone after school, felt the tension in the air transmitted through the screen like electricity conducted through water, and every camera flash, every note-taking reporter, every whispered question between journalists amplified the stakes to levels that made her stomach flip. The wealthy, the powerful, the supposedly untouchable were about to be exposed not by lawyers or board members or corporate rivals, but by the silent, calculated moves of a 12-year-old girl they had humiliated just days ago, whose tears they'd considered entertainment, whose dignity they'd trampled like it was worthless. Preston stepped up to the podium looking like he hadn't slept in days, his polished facade cracking with every flash of light, with every second that passed, and he cleared his throat twice before speaking. We regret the confusion surrounding the Vail Industries deal. It has been a challenging situation for everyone involved, and we want to assure our investors and partners that we are taking the necessary steps to. His voice faltered as reporters shouted questions over each other, a feeding frenzy of voices that drowned out his carefully rehearsed speech, cameras capturing every twitch, every grimace, every moment of visible panic that leaked through his mask. His mother tried to intervene, stepping forward with a smile, so forced it looked painful, smoothing her designer dress with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. We assure everyone that we are taking full responsibility and implementing new protocols to ensure this never happens again. We value integrity, but the press wasn't buying it, wasn't accepting the corporate speak and empty promises, because overnight someone had leaked documents to 3 major news outlets, emails that showed patterns of ethical violations, internal memos that revealed a culture of casual cruelty towards staff, and compliance reviews that had been ignored for years because the family believed their wealth made them immune to rules that governed everyone else. Preston's carefully constructed image of control was unraveling in real time, thread by thread, broadcast live to millions of people, and each revelation, each public exposure, was a ripple that Nyla had set in motion without ever showing her face, without ever raising her voice, without doing anything that would make her visible to the people who decided she was invisible. A reporter's voice cut sharply through the hall like a knife through butter. "Mr. Vail, are you aware that your family's company is being investigated for workplace violations, specifically regarding the treatment of minor employees? And can you comment on reports that a 12-year-old was humiliated by your son while working in your home?" Preston's face drained of color, so completely he looked like a marble statue, bloodless and frozen, and his parents' confidence evaporated like water on hot pavement, replaced by the weight of public judgment that no amount of money could buy off or intimidate into silence. And Nyla, unnoticed in the back of that library, watching on a screen that showed her everything she needed to see, knew with perfect clarity that this was just the beginning, that the empire that had laughed at a small black girl while wine dripped down her face was learning exactly what consequences looked like when they finally arrived, and the lesson was being taught in the most public, most humiliating, most permanent way possible. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't loud or dramatic. They're calculated and quiet and observed by millions. They unfold slowly enough that everyone can see exactly how they happen, can understand exactly why they were deserved, can recognize the simple truth that cruelty always leaves a trail and justice always follows it home. And tonight the whole world was watching a 12-year-old girl prove that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage you can have, that silence can be the loudest weapon, that patience can be more destructive than rage, and that when you treat people like they're nothing, you better hope they don't turn out to be everything you should have feared. The mansion was eerily silent in a way that made the silence itself feel alive, breathing, watching, the kind of quiet that presses on your chest and makes every heartbeat sound like a drum announcing something terrible. And Preston's parents sat in the drawing room slumped over velvet chairs that cost more than most people's cars, their faces pale and rigid like wax figures of themselves, like hollow copies of the confident people they'd been just days ago. Their empire, once untouchable as the sun, as permanent as mountains, as inevitable as inheritance, was unraveling before their eyes in ways they couldn't stop, couldn't control, couldn't buy their way out of. And for the first time in their privileged lives, they understood what true vulnerability felt like, what it meant to be powerless while the world watched and judged and remembered. Not with wealth, not with influence, not with threats or lawyers or the kind of connections that usually made problems disappear like magic tricks. None of it worked anymore. None of it mattered because the foundation they'd built everything on turned out to be sand, not stone, and now the tide was coming in. Nyla, sitting quietly on the staircase above where she'd been called back one final time to help with something nobody could quite explain, watched it all unfold with eyes that had seen too much too fast, and the weight of what she had set in motion finally settled on her small shoulders like a coat that was too heavy but fit perfectly. She was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with carrying knowledge that 12-year-olds shouldn't have to carry, understanding that the world was crueler and more breakable than anyone wanted to admit. Preston's father's voice broke the silence, barely audible, stripped of every ounce of authority he'd always worn like a second skin. I don't understand. I've controlled everything my entire life, built this empire from what my father left me, expanded it, protected it, and now we're losing control over what? Over a child? Over a maid? How do we lose control to someone we never even saw as a threat? His mother shook her head slowly, eyes wide with something that looked like genuine fear mixed with disbelief and the dawning horror of understanding. We've controlled everything. Always money fixes things, lawyers handle problems, influence opens doors, but none of it's working now. Why isn't any of it working? The irony was sharp enough to cut bone, bitter enough to taste, because they had believed wealth equaled dominance, that entitlement equaled authority, that cruelty equaled power, and now every assumption lay in ruins around them like broken glass, dangerous and irreparable. And in that quiet, devastating moment where reality finally penetrated their bubble of privilege, Nyla's presence, the very thing they had dismissed as easily as they dismissed her dignity, loomed larger than any of their fortunes, more powerful than any connection they'd cultivated, more real than any illusion they'd maintained. Downstairs, Preston paced in circles that went nowhere, trapped in the echo of his own mistakes, and his parents sat frozen, prisoners of consequences they'd never imagined would apply to them, because consequences were for other people, for poor people, for people who didn't have last names that opened doors and silenced critics. And Nyla, small and underestimated and systematically ignored, realized with a clarity that felt almost painful that this was the most important lesson she would ever learn, more valuable than anything school could teach. Power is never about who laughs the loudest or who has the most money or who can hurt people without caring. Power is about who waits patiently, who observes carefully, who understands that timing and information and courage matter more than inherited wealth could ever buy. Tonight, they had learned it the hardest way possible, learned it in front of cameras and reporters and board members and the entire world watching their fall from grace. Learned it from a 12-year-old who they'd treated like furniture, like nothing, like someone whose feelings and dignity and humanity didn't count because she was poor and young and black and therefore, in their twisted logic, dismissible. And if you've ever watched someone who thought they were invincible, someone who believed their money made them better, someone who laughed at pain they caused because they'd never experienced real consequences, if you've ever watched them realize too late that they were wrong about everything, that their power was an illusion maintained by the silence of people they'd hurt. You know exactly why this moment mattered more than any apology could fix, why this lesson would follow them forever, why. The memory of being brought down by someone they'd underestimated would haunt them longer than any business failure. Because the cruelest truth is this: they could have avoided all of it, every bit of this destruction, if they just treated one 12-year-old girl with the basic dignity that every human being deserves, if they'd seen her as a person instead of as furniture, if they'd understood that kindness costs nothing while cruelty eventually costs everything. The email pinged quietly in Nyla's grandmother's study at exactly 3 in the morning. The sound barely audible, but the effect anything but quiet, like a match struck in a room full of gasoline, and it was a single, deliberate leak that Nyla had scheduled days ago, but only now released. A complete copy of the correspondence detailing the canceled $400 million deal, the board's unanimous decision, and the precise chain of events that had led to Preston's parents' very public humiliation, all of it documented with timestamps and signatures that couldn't be disputed or explained away. Within minutes, not hours but actual minutes, reporters were buzzing like disturbed hornets. Social media platforms exploded with shares and comments and hot takes. And financial analysts scrambled to update their morning reports because this wasn't just business news anymore. This was a cultural moment, a David and Goliath story that people couldn't stop talking about, couldn't stop sharing, couldn't look away from even if they wanted to. The empire they had believed was unshakable, built on decades of carefully managed public relations and strategic donations, and the kind of influence that money buys when you have enough of it, was now exposed to the scrutiny of millions of eyes that saw everything, judged everything, remembered everything. Downstairs in a mansion where Nyla had been staying overnight in the staff quarters because her grandmother was sick and couldn't pick her up, Preston's parents stumbled over each other in the pre-dawn darkness, frantically trying to contain a narrative that had already escaped, trying to catch smoke with their bare hands. "We can explain this," Preston's father stammered into his phone, his voice trembling with exhaustion and desperation. "It's just a misunderstanding, a series of unfortunate miscommunications. We can fix this." But the words fell flat, hollow, unconvincing even to his own ears, because every attempt at control only made their mistakes more visible, more damning, more permanent. Preston himself paced the library like a caged animal that had finally realized the cage had no door and never had. His fists clenched so tight his nails drew blood from his palms. His jaw set in a line that would have looked determined if his eyes hadn't betrayed the pure panic underneath. He had always believed he could command any situation, manipulate any outcome, bend reality to match his desires through sheer force of will and inherited privilege. And yet here he was, watching everything collapse because someone he had dismissed, someone he had humiliated for entertainment, someone whose name he probably couldn't remember even now, had seen him clearly when he thought he was invisible to people who did matter. Nyla, sitting silently in the back of her grandmother's study through a video call her grandmother had set up so she could witness this moment, felt the tension as a physical presence, a weight against her chest that made breathing feel like work. She had planned this leak with surgical precision, timing it to ensure maximum impact when their defenses were lowest, when exhaustion had stripped away their ability to spin and deflect and redirect, and the result was immediate and devastating. The social media feeds lit up like Christmas trees. News outlets scrambled to be first with analysis and commentary, and within hours the story was trending not just nationally but internationally, because people everywhere understood injustice when they saw it, recognized arrogance getting its comeuppance, couldn't resist a story where the powerless somehow found power and used it with precision that the powerful could never match. Her grandmother's hand rested on her shoulder through the screen somehow, steady and reassuring even across the digital distance. "Remember, baby, clarity and timing are everything in this world. The universe responds not just to action, but to the precision of action, to knowing exactly when to move and when to wait, and you've learned that lesson better than most. People learn it in a lifetime." Downstairs, the Vale family was crumbling in real time, their confidence replaced by raw fear that no amount of money could mask. their arrogance replaced by desperate bargaining with a universe that had stopped listening to their demands. And above it all, in a small study in a small apartment in a neighborhood they would never visit, Nyla realized a profound truth that would shape the rest of her life. Those who underestimate the quiet, the patient, the observant are doomed to be undone by the very power they ignored. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't loud or violent or dramatic. It's just the simple act of letting people see the truth they worked so hard to hide, of removing the curtain they built to protect themselves from consequences, of proving that no amount of wealth can buy immunity from karma when karma finally decides to collect what it's owed. The gala had been planned months in advance as a celebration, a showcase of wealth and influence where the elite gathered to see and be seen, but instead it became the stage for a reckoning that nobody saw coming, and the crystal chandeliers that reflected the glittering crowd seemed to mock the festivities because everyone in that ballroom knew the truth, even if they weren't saying it out loud. The true spectacle wasn't the opulent decorations, or the designer gowns, or the champagne that cost more per bottle than most people made in a week. It was the tension that coiled through the room like a living thing, electric and dangerous, impossible to ignore no matter how hard people try to maintain their polished smiles. Preston's parents walked through the ballroom with carefully rehearsed expressions that fooled absolutely nobody, desperately trying to mask the tremors beneath their expensive clothes, and every step felt heavy with the weight of scrutiny from hundreds of eyes that had once looked at them with envy, but now looked with something closer to fascination, the way people watch a building collapse in slow motion, unable to look away from disaster. Every glance around the room was a reminder of their fragility. Every whispered conversation that stopped when they approached was evidence that their fall from grace was the only thing anyone wanted to discuss, and the social currency they'd spent decades accumulating had evaporated faster than morning dew under a cruel sun. Nyla, hidden in plain sight behind the catering station where she'd volunteered to help serve because her grandmother thought it would be educational to see how the other half lived one more time, observed the scene with the composure of someone far beyond her 12 years, someone who had learned that true power doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It moves quietly until the exact moment when being loud matters most. She had been underestimated since the moment she stepped into their world, laughed at and humiliated and ignored as if her feelings and dignity were optional accessories they could discard when convenient. But tonight, standing in that ballroom, surrounded by people who thought money could buy immunity from consequences, every action, every whisper, every subtle movement she had orchestrated over the past days converged for a single, explosive moment. The first whisper began near the press section where journalists had been invited to cover the gala as a society event, but now circled like sharks who'd caught the scent of blood in the water, and a reporter quietly nudged a colleague, pointing discreetly toward Preston's father. "You won't believe the documents that just went public an hour ago. Financial irregularities going back years. Testimony from former employees about workplace violations. Evidence that suggests this family has been cutting corners and covering tracks longer than anyone suspected." Within seconds, the murmur spread, rippling like wildfire across the room. Phones came out not to take selfies, but to check breaking news alerts, and faces that had been polite and neutral began to shift into expressions of shock and judgment. Preston's mother grabbed her husband's arm with enough force to leave marks, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the panic finally breaking through. What is happening? Why are people staring? What have they seen? But it was too late for damage control, too late for explanations or spin or the usual tactics they deployed when problems arose. Because the evidence, the cold, hard facts that Nyla had meticulously compiled and strategically released through channels they'd never thought to monitor, had reached every corner of the ballroom simultaneously. The empire they had built on pride and entitlement and the casual cruelty of people who'd never been told no was unraveling publicly, spectacularly, and irreversibly, and every eye in that room could see it happening in real time. Nyla's grandmother stood beside her behind the catering table, whispering just loud enough for Nyla to hear over. The growing chaos, This is the power of precision, baby, of patience, of understanding that the right information delivered at the right moment can move mountains that money can't even touch, and nobody in this room will ever forget what they're witnessing tonight. And in that moment, as the ballroom erupted into barely contained chaos, as reporters rushed toward exits to file urgent stories, as social media feeds exploded with real-time updates from attendees who couldn't resist sharing the scandal, the room didn't just watch. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that power had been redefined tonight not through wealth or privilege or inherited status, but through intelligence, strategy, and the courage of a 12-year-old black girl who refused to accept that being underestimated meant being powerless. By the end of the night, Preston's parents were left grappling with humiliation that no amount of money could erase, standing in an emptying ballroom where their supposed friends couldn't flee fast enough, while Nyla stepped back into the shadows where she'd always been most comfortable, quiet and calm and victorious in a way that had nothing to do with gloating and everything to do with justice finally being served. Because sometimes the smallest voices leave the loudest echoes. And tonight hers would be remembered forever as the voice that brought down an empire built on cruelty, the voice that proved dignity matters more than wealth, the voice that showed the world that consequences always find their way home eventually. And when they arrive, no amount of money can stop them from collecting what they're owed. The early morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Vale mansion with a brightness that felt almost offensive given everything that had happened, illuminating the remnants of a night that had changed everything. And Preston's parents sat in stunned silence at the dining table, where they'd laughed at Nyla's humiliation just days before, their carefully curated world now in ruins around them like shattered glass that could never be swept clean. The opulence that surrounded them, the chandeliers dripping with crystal, the gold trim that lined every doorway, the marble floors that had cost more than most houses, all of it felt hollow now. Meaningless, like props on a stage after the play had ended and the audience had gone home disappointed. Their empire, built on decades of wealth and arrogance, and the absolute certainty that money could protect them from consequences, had collapsed not with a dramatic explosion, but with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, cut away piece by piece until nothing solid remained. Nyla stepped into the main hall one final time, called there by her grandmother who'd been summoned to collect payment for the week's work, and her small frame was almost lost among the grand furniture, yet she carried herself with a presence that filled every corner of that massive room, a quiet confidence that made everyone who saw her suddenly understand that size has nothing to do with power, that volume has nothing to do with strength. Every eye that caught hers felt the weight of her intelligence, her calmness, her absolute certainty in what she'd done and why it mattered, and the undeniable truth hung in the air like smoke. She had been the force behind the unraveling of a $400 million deal, the architect of their downfall, the reason their phones wouldn't stop ringing with lawyers and reporters and former business partners demanding explanations. Preston, who'd been pacing all night according to the dark circles under his eyes and the wrinkled clothes he was still wearing, finally stopped moving and stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been respect if his pride would allow it. How could this happen? You're just a child, just a maid. How could you possibly understand corporate structures and compliance violations and board dynamics? His voice cracked on those last words, revealing not just frustration, but the profound realization that control and power could never be assumed simply because one was born wealthy, that intelligence and determination could trump inherited privilege every single time. Nyla didn't respond, didn't need to, because her silence said everything that needed saying, and her grandmother appeared beside her with a quiet smile that carried generations of wisdom earned through surviving things that should have broken lesser people. It's always the underestimated ones who hold the most power, her grandmother said. Not to Preston, but to Nyla, speaking loud enough that everyone in that entrance hall could hear. Those who act with patience and intelligence and courage rarely need to shout, rarely need to make threats, rarely need to do anything except wait for the right moment, and then strike with precision that leaves everyone wondering what just happened. The world outside had already begun its reaction in ways that would echo for years. Social media is still exploding with commentary and analysis. News channels running continuous coverage with legal experts debating implications, and investors adjusting their positions in real time as the Veil name, once untouchable as royalty, became associated with humiliation and poor judgment and the stark consequences of underestimating people you consider beneath you. And yet, standing in that mansion surrounded by wealth that suddenly meant nothing, Nyla understood that this moment was not about revenge in the petty sense, not about making them suffer for the sake of suffering. It was about justice, about showing the world that dignity and strategy and courage matter infinitely more than arrogance and entitlement ever could. She had turned humiliation into empowerment, had transformed laughter into the most expensive lesson they would ever receive, had converted invisibility into undeniable presence that would be studied and discussed and remembered long after the wine stains had faded from her old uniform. As the mansion fell into the quiet aftermath of destruction, as lawyers began arriving for emergency meetings that wouldn't save anything, as the reality settled over everyone present that some things, once broken, can never be repaired, one truth became absolutely certain. The Veil family would never forget the day a 12-year-old Maid canceled their $400 million deal, changed the trajectory of their lives forever, and redefined what power actually means in a world that had taught them all the wrong lessons. Nyla, small but unstoppable, patient but decisive, underestimated but victorious, had rewritten the rules of engagement between the powerful and the powerless, had proven that justice delayed is not justice denied as long as someone remembers, someone waits, someone acts when the moment is exactly right, and the world, millions of people watching from their phones and computers and television screens, had witnessed every moment of it, had seen proof that sometimes the smallest voices leave the loudest echoes, that sometimes the quietest actions create the biggest earthquakes, that sometimes a 12-year-old girl with nothing but intelligence and courage and a grandmother who taught her that patience is a weapon can bring down an empire that thought itself invincible. And tonight, this morning, forever after, hers would be the story people told when they needed to believe that David could still beat Goliath, that right could still triumph over might, that karma was real, and eventually, inevitably, absolutely, it comes for everyone who forgets that every person matters. Every action has consequences, and cruelty, no matter how casual, always leaves a debt that must be paid. If you made it here, then it's a sign that you are destined for this. Subscribe to the channel now, so this won't be the last time you'll come across stories like this. Thanks for watching.